Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here, and today I would like to take a look at the life and times of Basil I the Macedonian, who served as Byzantium's ruler between 867 and 886. Basil is someone who has attracted quite a bit of controversy, but he is also universally regarded as one of the great emperors of Byzantium. He, of course, is most known for founding the Macedonian dynasty, and if you know anything else about him, you know that he had his fair share of capers and misadventures, most of which were actually the result of a lot of political calculation and involved quite a bit of bloodshed. And for that reason, he is undoubtedly my favorite emperor, and I imagine he's the favorite emperor of quite a few people who are interested in Byzantine history. So we're going to take a look at him today, but if you'd like to learn more about some of the more sordid details of Basil's life, then I recommend doing two things. First, you should check out my previous video on Michael III the Drunkard, where I go into Basil's time under Michael as his Caesar and then later as his co-emperor. The other thing that you should do is go to Patreon and become a supporter. If you become a patron, you'll have access to a video I'm in the process of making where I'm going to go over all of Basil's sordid deeds in a lot more detail than I do either in this video or in the previous Michael III video. So I highly recommend checking that out. And another reason to support me on Patreon, other than that YouTube has been screwing me over by not approving my channel for monetization despite being held for further review for several months at this point. The other reason that would benefit you is that I am working on a series on Alexander's successors, and you will be able to see an exclusive preview if you become a patron. So anyway, that would mean you get to see the stuff a month in advance, or at least have an idea of what's coming down the pike. This is actually about the third time I have recorded this video on Basil I. I upgraded my PowerPoint to 365, and it works a lot differently, and it is really pissing me off, but I'm going to persevere, and we're going to get through this together. So buckle up, and let's talk about Basil I the Macedonian and all of the cool shit that he did. Since we're about to embark on one of the most interesting and controversial reigns in history, it only makes sense to begin at the beginning. Not that I would do it any other way, since this is how I've done all of my videos. At any rate, though, let's look at Basil's origins and early life. He was most likely born in either Thrace or Macedonia in 811, but his family was probably an Armenian family that had been resettled in the area earlier in the century. If you'll recall, it was a fairly standard practice to relocate families from one area of the empire to another in order to make sure that the state was not totally dependent on any one ethnicity in any area. Another reason for moving people to Europe was that the Byzantines were trying to repopulate the area. It had really been neglected for a couple centuries following the outbreak of the so-called Byzantine Dark Ages, which sort of corresponded with the period of the Great War of Heraclius and then later the Arab invasions. As an adult, Basil moved to Constantinople to make a name for himself. We don't know exactly when he did this, but we know that by the 850s he was living in Constantinople and he was a professional wrestler. So again, this is evidence that Basil was a man of pretty impressive physical vigor, since he would have already had to have been in his 40s by this point, yet he was still an active and successful wrestler. When we look at, actual Greco-Roman style wrestling, a lot of people age out of that by the time they're about 28 or 29, so the fact that Basil was still going strong well into his 40s is pretty damn impressive. We also know that in general Basil was very physically active, and that one of his favorite things to do was engage in the hunt. We'll see a story later that suggests that Basil was a bit more reckless than most when it came to his hunting habits. We also know that at a certain point in his young adulthood, he married a woman named Maria, and that they had produced a son together named Constantine. Basil and Constantine were very close, and once he becomes emperor later on, Basil will intend all along for Constantine to be his eventual heir and to hold the throne after him. But as we'll see, that doesn't quite work out. Since Basil was someone who didn't have a great deal of wealth, a formal education, or a famous family name, it was going to take a lot for him to really rise to prominence in the Byzantine world. Luckily for him, the new emperor, the teenage Michael III the Drunkard, was a big wrestling fan. So Basil gained some fame in Constantinople by defeating several prominent Bulgarian wrestlers, and this brought him into young Michael III's entourage. So at this time, it would have had a bit of a patriotic undertone to it that we have this native-born Byzantine subject defeating these Bulgarians from this newfangled empire beyond the frontier. So this would make Basil a bit of a hero for people who identified as Roman. Despite a 29-year age gap between Michael and Basil, they quickly became close friends, and Michael began to award Basil with offices, honors, and money. So Basil will rise up to become one of Michael's chief advisors and also to gain access to his person as his chamberlain. They may have partied together. Certainly, all of our information on Michael seems to suggest that he liked to get drunk and have a good time. But it's also possible that because Basil was, so much older, but also had this reputation for being tough and vigorous, that Michael envisioned Basil more as sort of like a surrogate father figure. Remember, Michael's father Theophilus had died when he was really young, and maybe he wanted the experience of having an older, strong male role model there to look out for him and protect him from people who are trying to take advantage of him. So there could be something like that going on. Maybe, Michael was like this little kid who was really enamored with Hulk Hogan, and then Hulk Hogan becomes his man nanny. Not that I'm referencing an old shitty 90s movie, but I'm totally doing that. Mr. Nanny. Anyway, so Michael and Basil are now friends, and because of that friendship, Basil now has a path to power. So this is how he gets from being just some wrestler to being someone who's involved in the inner workings of the Byzantine Empire. Let's briefly recap the course of Michael III's reign. So for the first half or so of his reign, from 842 to 855, Michael was under the tutelage of his mother and some other advisors. And then he had come of age, he had tried to claim that he should rule in his own right, and the adults had said no, so he turned to his two uncles, Bardas and Petronas, and then he had established rule in his own name. Well, because of this, after 855, Bardas is increasingly the effective emperor, and he had even become Caesar. So the idea here is that because Michael didn't seem likely to produce an heir, and because his drinking habits seemed likely to doom him to an early death, his still young uncle Bardas was going to be his successor, and everything would be fine. Well, it looks like Michael wasn't completely happy with this arrangement for whatever reason, despite the fact that Bardas was completely loyal and was actually doing a really great job running the empire. So as he begins to really associate with Basil more, Michael turns more toward Basil as his protector rather than Bardas. And Basil develops a dislike for Bardas, which most likely is based solely on his own desire to enhance his position. So he foments discontent between Michael and his uncle Bardas. At one point, Basil is plotting murder against Bardas, and then Bardas finds out, and they have a peace conference where Basil and Michael convincingly lie and assure Bardas that they have no intentions of killing him. With those assurances, Bardas was secure, or at least he thought he was, and then Basil managed to take him by surprise and have him murdered soon thereafter, as depicted on screen. And after Basil and his men kill Bardas, presumably they did so with Michael's blessing, although it's also possible that he just went ahead and did it and told Michael about it later. Anyway, Michael declared that Basil would succeed Bardas as the new Caesar. So this is a pretty odd situation where you kill a ruler's uncle and you get to take the uncle's place. It's kind of nuts, but this is what happened. Not long after Basil became Caesar, Michael decided to elevate Basil to full imperial status and have him serve as his co-emperor. So now we have two emperors who are equal to one another, ruling in tandem. Now, Michael would actually still have seniority because he'd been on the throne longer, but for all practical intents and purposes, Basil is already emperor when this happens. I think the biggest factor in Michael's decision was actually that he wanted someone who was a full partner in government who would bear the burden for him. He didn't want to have to run the government by himself, and he knew that Basil was more than willing to do the job for him. The sources, which tend to be hostile especially to Michael, suggest that the real reason why Michael wanted Basil to be his full colleague is that Basil had married Michael's former mistress Eudokia in Gerona at Michael's suggestion, and that the reason for both this marriage and his elevation to the status of full emperor is so that they could live in the same palace, and therefore Michael could sneak off and visit Eudokia in Gerona without anyone really asking any questions or without it rousing any suspicions. After all, Michael was married to someone else, and it doesn't really look great if you have an emperor dallying about with someone other than his wife. So if your mistress is hidden in the imperial chambers anyway, well, no one can tell what you're doing. Anyway, I don't think that Basil is a weak enough personality to have allowed something like that to happen, but it's hard to say. So anyway, we'll talk more about this really sordid stuff with Eudokia and Gerona in the Patreon-only video, so I'll leave that here, and we'll move on. When Macbeth killed his king and seized power, he was coming from a position of not being king and then using that murder to make himself king. So whatever you might think about the deed itself, it made quite a bit of sense. However, in Basil's case, it's a lot more difficult to find his motive for the time that he pulled off a very Macbeth-esque murder, but without having a very clear motive for doing so. Let's examine. One night the two emperors and their two empresses were dining together in one of the suburban palaces, and as often happened, Michael had too much to drink, and he needed to go lie down, and he passed out completely wasted. In the middle of the night, Basil and some fellow conspirators burst into Michael's chambers and duly killed him. Basil then hurried back to the city with Eudokia and Gerona, declared himself sole ruler, and he claimed that he had acted in the state's best interest by getting rid of someone who was an embarrassment and a liability. How well received this was, I can't say, but we will look at some potential problems that Basil incurred by doing this act. At any rate, it feels to me like Basil probably was able to do whatever he wanted anyway, and Michael didn't pose much of a legitimate threat. For whatever reason, I have read some modern scholars who feel that Michael was never going to be able to reproduce, even though Michael was still in his 20s, and there's really no evidence that he was infertile. So maybe Basil's thinking was that eventually Michael would get someone pregnant, and that would really jeopardize the ability of Basil to pass the throne on to his sons. I don't know exactly what Basil's thinking was here, but it certainly couldn't have been that he didn't have enough control over the state, since by all indications he was really running the show and Michael was playing very much a secondary, behind-the-scenes role. When it comes to both Michael III and Basil I, we have a fairly large historiographical problem, and that problem is, to keep it simple, that there were a lot of people with a vested interest in obscuring the details of what these two guys were like, what they did, and how Basil came to power. This was an embarrassing rise to power in early life for a Byzantine emperor, being a professional wrestler who then joined an entourage and was one of the boys, but then, engaged in multiple murders to seize power. That's not exactly awe-inspiring stuff. So when Basil's grandson Constantine VII, who incidentally was one of the greatest writers and scholars in Byzantine history, came to power, he thought to himself, hey, maybe I need to church up my granddad's image a bit in order to make my family even more legitimate. So he wrote a biography of Basil, which then became the standard account of Basil's life. And in Constantine's account of Basil, Basil was someone who overthrew the corrupt Amorian dynasty, and he was also a busy administrator, patron of the arts, and protector of the poor and downtrodden. Most likely the real-life Basil was all of these things, but he was also a ruthless murderer, and I don't think that we should forget that. So yes, Basil did go out and make the world a better place, and he did found a dynasty which brought greatness to the Byzantine Empire. However, he was also a bloodthirsty killer, and his ambition knew no bounds. So, it's really hard to get at the real person, and in a minute I'm going to suggest that a lot of the more lurid details of Basil's reign actually came from none other than Basil himself. Why, you ask? Keep watching and all will be revealed. Of all the things that Basil I managed to accomplish as emperor, the thing that actually surprises me the most is that in the wake of his brutal murder and obvious coup to seize power, there wasn't a revolt. There was no one who claimed to be either an avenger of the Amorians or some lost cousin of the Amorians looking to keep the family in power. Somehow Basil managed to stage manage his rise to power to the extent that he was able to avoid a revolt. This is especially surprising when you realize that all of the ingredients needed for a second attempt at a usurpation were all in play. Basil's rise to power was unexpected, and many people were not happy. The main people who were unhappy, who were the exact group of people you don't want to be unhappy, were the army. The Byzantine army had been very successful under all three Amorian emperors dating back to Michael II. And Michael III especially had presided over quite a few military victories. His two uncles, Bardas and Petronas, had been two very good generals, and especially in the case of Bardas, they had done quite a bit to advance the interest of the empire. Michael III's father, Theophilus, was also something of a national hero. He was the JFK of the 9th century. So what does Basil do in order to defeat this potential challenge to his power? Well, the first thing he has to do is try to really shore up his legitimacy. Now, going into 867, when he seizes sole control, Basil had two sons, Constantine and his young son Leo, who was by Eudokia and Gerona. Now, because of the prior relationship between Michael III and Eudokia and Gerona when they were teenagers, the rumor was that Leo was secretly Michael's son. So in order to shore up his own position, Basil had to create a line of succession. By this time, he's a middle-aged man, and even though he was a healthy and vigorous guy, you know, if you're middle-aged in this time, you could pretty much just keel over at any time for no apparent reason. So Basil decides to set up a line of succession. He makes both Constantine and Leo co-emperors in 869 and 870 respectively. Constantine by this point is probably a young adult, whereas Leo is a small child. Now, supposedly, our sources are very clear that Basil always hated Leo and preferred Constantine. But what I will argue is that it's very possible that Basil is the source of the rumor that Leo was Michael's son. And the reason why he would spread such a rumor, which you might think, hey, that would undermine him because he's going to have Leo succeed him, and that would bring Leo's legitimacy into question. No, what happened, I think, is that Basil spread this rumor early on as a way to deter a potential revolt. Because if Leo is in line to succeed to the throne, and he is actually Michael's son rather than Basil's, then this means that there's no point in revolting on Leo's behalf, because he will come to power anyway, and all will be set right, and that fool Basil doesn't even know that his son and heir is actually the son and heir of the guy he murdered. So it's kind of a divine revenge, if you will. So I think that Basil's actually the guy who set this up. So that way people would look at this situation and feel a little bit less motivation to get rid of the usurper. But again, I'm just grasping at straws to some extent, and I would also argue so were all the people who said that Michael was the real father of Leo. A lot of this was just speculation that got recorded as history. But since that's what we got to work with, I'm working with it. Anyway, let's move on. Just like all of his predecessors and all of his successors, one of the main things that Basil had to do as emperor was to set religious policy and work it into the larger framework of his overall policy. When he had been co-emperor with Michael, Basil had supported Patriarch Photius. However, in November of 867, things changed a bit when Pope Nicholas died and he was replaced by Pope Hadrian II. The difference is that whereas Pope Nicholas was hostile to Constantinople, Hadrian II was willing to work with Basil provided that certain conditions were met. So Basil decided to meet Hadrian halfway in order to repair the relationship between the East and the West. And one of his early acts was to remove Photius as the patriarch and reinstate the previous patriarch Ignatius. If you'll recall, Ignatius was something of a zealot, and he also was someone who had an interesting background since he had been the grandson of Nicephorus I and the son of Michael I Rangabi, who was then forced to take vows once Michael was overthrown by another emperor. Anyway, this change in leadership was meant to appease the zealots at home. That was one of the main focuses. Get rid of a patriarch who was not seen as particularly pious, which is obviously a case of the pot calling the kettle black as a way to distract, something that we see a lot of in today's world. And to appeal to the Pope in Rome for reasons that we will lay out, mainly dealing with Byzantine holdings in Italy. So what I see from this is that Basil was someone who practiced realpolitik and that his theological convictions were based mostly on what he needed to believe to get things done for the empire. So what was it that Basil was hoping to achieve in Italy? Well, to put it simply, his hope was that if he could reconcile with the papacy religiously, that this could be the basis for military cooperation between the Christian powers in Italy to drive back all of the Arab advances there. To appease the papacy, Basil ended up presiding over a council attended by papal delegates where Photius was anathematized. So not only did Photius lose his job as the Patriarch of Constantinople, but he was also excommunicated. For Photius, this must have been a low point in his life, if not the low point. So why was this council politically interesting? Well, a couple reasons. The main reason is that it really shows off the full extent of Basil's political repertoire. Despite the fact that this man had no formal education and might not have even been literate, Basil was a political genius. A lot of previous Byzantine emperors had really not been all that great at striking a balance between preserving the dignity of Byzantium and its prerogatives with meeting the Pope far enough without giving up too much. But Basil stage managed this brilliantly, because what he does is he presides over the council, so that makes it look like he is in charge and that the East has some degree of primacy when it comes to Eastern affairs. This runs contrary to what some popes would claim, that the papacy holds supremacy on all matters religious, no matter what see they happen to occur in. On the other hand, though, the papacy got what it wanted policy-wise. They got rid of Photius, and their delegates voted in a majority. So what ends up happening is Basil finds a way for both sides to get what they want without having to sacrifice anything. And that is the definition of a political compromise that works, because a good compromise is one where everyone is happy and no one really feels like their butthole is chafed. So Basil did a masterful job of making sure that everyone escaped with their ego intact and really set the stage for a cooperative effort in Italy. However, as we'll see, things didn't end up working out, but it's not entirely Basil's fault. So, what ended up happening? Before this ecumenical council had disbanded, news arrived from Bulgaria that the ruler of Bulgaria, Boris Michael, who had converted to Christianity after being defeated by Michael III, had just defeated about 4 or 5 years of aristocratic revolt, and he wanted to move forward with Christianization. And he was looking to get an archbishop from Constantinople. However, he did have a question for the council, and that question was whether Bulgaria would fall under the jurisdiction of Rome or Constantinople. Now, what Boris Michael was looking for was certain concessions when it came to how religion would be practiced in his lands. After all, he had a large population of people who were not happy with a lot of social changes, so he was looking for a better deal. This was basically what he was doing, was shopping around for the version of Christianity which would best fit the needs of the people of Bulgaria, and he was playing Rome and Constantinople off against each other to make sure that he got what he wanted. Now, it turns out that because Rome and Constantinople would each pick themselves to be the hegemon of the church that the Bulgarians would join, they decided not to vote in this, and they decided to leave it to the patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, who presumably would act in a neutral fashion. And all three of those patriarchs said that Constantinople should preside over the Bulgarian church. And this is not something that sat well with the papal delegates, who all left in a huff. And when they left, interestingly enough, they ended up being kidnapped by pirates and held for several months. But enough about them. So this was a religious feud that Basil and the Macedonians had won, or not the Macedonians, the Byzantines, excuse me. So in 870, Ignatius sent an archbishop out to Bulgaria, and he also sent several bishops. And in theory, the Bulgarian church was under Constantinople, because they'd had to compete with Rome to get Bulgaria under their sway. Basically, the Bulgarian church was effectively autonomous, and it was only nominally responsible to the church at Constantinople. But at any rate, this was both a victory for Basil and a defeat, in that it sort of alienated the papacy and put a bit of a strain on the relationship between Byzantium and its allies in Italy. But even then, this by itself was not enough to derail Basil's plan. However, other things certainly were. At the same time that he was mending fences in Italy with the Pope, Basil was also really working over the Holy Roman Emperor Louis II and setting up the groundwork for a cooperative military campaign against the Arabs in southern Italy. And this alliance would have two aspects early on. So it looks like the idea here was that the Byzantine navy would help the Holy Roman Empire, where the Holy Roman Empire would be more inclined to provide foot soldiers and manpower to Byzantium, which was a little thinner on the ground in Italy. So to make this happen, Basil agrees to send naval support to Louis II's siege efforts at Bari, and Basil's oldest son, Constantine, is engaged with Louis's daughter. However, things quickly fall apart when Admiral Nicetas arrives from Constantinople in 869, and he meets with Louis II. First of all, he's really appalled at how much smaller and less organized the Frankish force was than what he had been led to believe, and apparently he also found these forces to be inferior to the armies that Byzantium fielded. So he was disgusted by this enough that when he met with Louis, he insulted him by addressing him as king rather than emperor. And this had been a bone of contention between Byzantium and the Holy Roman Empire ever since Charlemagne. The idea was that the emperors of the West were trying to claim the title of emperor in the full sense, the full Roman sense, but the Eastern emperors were trying to make that an exclusive prerogative for themselves. So this had been something that the Byzantines had more or less granted to them for political purposes, but then Nicetas was somewhat pulling this honor back, and Louis II was not having it. So the two of them yelled at each other for a while, and then Nicetas took his ships and went home, leaving Louis holding the bag. Now Louis eventually did pull off the siege of Bari and took the city in 871, but his control of the city was short-lived, as he would soon fall prey to the Lombards and be forced to sign an agreement relinquishing his ambitions in South Italy. At the same time, after Nicetas went home, the engagement between Louis's daughter and Constantine was broken off, and this really impaired any follow-up to that one first failed attempt. So basically, the person responsible for screwing up Basil's grand plan was his admiral Nicetas, and we don't really know what happened to Nicetas once he got home, but maybe Basil actually thought that Louis was at fault. We don't know. Anyway, hopefully for Nicetas, Basil didn't think that he was at fault, because we know what Basil does when he thinks that you are a liability. So just to recap, the combination of all of the bickering at Bari and then the winning of the Bulgarian church to the Byzantine fold effectively ended any chance of further cooperation between Byzantium with either the papacy or the Holy Roman Empire. However, despite those setbacks, the Byzantine armies which were stationed in Italy were still able to make gains against the Arabs after the Lombards expelled Louis II from South Italy. First of all, if we just expand our scope a little bit outside of Italy, we'll see that one thing that Byzantium is able to do is clear the Dalmatian coast and set up a new theme there. They were then able to establish hegemony over Adelchis of Benevento in 873. I believe he's the same ruler who had captured Louis II and forced him out of South Italy, but I might be wrong on that detail. The Byzantines also captured the key city of Otranto, and they also retook Bari in 876, so I imagine that Louis would have been glad to be dead by that point. Louis died in 875, because not only had the ally who insulted him and effectively betrayed him in his mind cost him some of the ground he was gaining in South Italy, but then they took a city that he had been investing for about 3 years, just half a decade earlier. So this shows you how far down the tubes that alliance had gone. Anyway, most of the real achievements that Byzantium had actually occurred after Basil, but I would argue that because Basil really revitalized Byzantine interest in Italy and putting resources into that interest, that the conquest of General Nicephorus Phocas at the end of the century were actually largely a result of the groundwork laid by Basil I. So credit where credit is due, at least as I see it. Basil presided over success in Italy. However, on most of the other secondary and tertiary fronts that Byzantium faced, Basil's reign actually didn't go that well. So if we look at where Byzantium was fighting newly established semi-independent Arab emirates, for the most part they were losing ground. In Sicily, just south of Italy, things actually went completely horribly. In 878, the city of Syracuse fell and Sicily was entirely lost. The manuscript drawing on the left of the screen is actually depicting the Arab storm of Syracuse. Basil also launched an expedition to recapture the island of Crete, which had fallen to an emirate there, but ultimately, despite some initial success, that expedition was unable to dislodge the Arabs from Crete. Most of Basil's military focus and personal attention were centered on the eastern provinces, as was often the case when it came to Byzantine military affairs, since that was where most of their armies were located. So let's now take a look at what Basil and the Byzantines did in the east, since that is where The real action occurred if we're looking at the number of men involved and the opponent, which in this case is the Abbasid Caliphate. So in previous videos, I've mentioned that there was a Christian sect called the Paulicians who lived in Asia Minor, and that they had started out peaceful and then grown to large size. They had also been persecuted by Byzantine emperors starting early in the 9th century, and that persecution had actually fueled their rise and given them a sense of militancy which they had not had before. Well, Basil is the guy who ends up inheriting the bad policy of, or at least the consequences of the bad policy of his predecessors. So by Basil's time, there was a strong leader for the Paulicians named Chrysocheir, and he had come to power in 863 and had also developed a military for the Paulicians, so they were ready to revolt from Byzantium. Interestingly enough, and totally in fitting with the general ridiculousness of Basil's reign, Chrysocheir means gold hand. So yes, Basil, in addition to being Macbeth, also was James Bond and fought someone with a golden hand. Maybe he was more like Austin Powers and he fought Goldmember. I don't know. Anyway, Basil and his brother-in-law Christopher had two major campaigns deep into the Paulican heartland. In 872, at the end of the second of these campaigns, Christopher destroyed Chrysocheir's fortified capital of Tefriki, and this effectively ended the Paulican movement as a political and military force. And after this point, now Basil and his armies will be able to campaign extensively in the east at the expense of the Abbasid Caliphate. So let's take a look at what Basil's armies in the east were able to accomplish. For about a decade after the final fall of Chrysocheir, Basil had the initiative in the east, and he was able to campaign every year in the Euphrates Valley, and he was able to capture things every year. The two biggest pickups were the cities of Zapetra and Samosata, but there were also others that fell into Byzantine hands and had probably not been in Byzantine hands for a couple centuries by this point. However, early in the 880s, Basil suffered a fairly major defeat near the city of Tarsus, and this temporarily ground Byzantine momentum to a halt. However, Byzantine initiative was soon restored, and it looks like the trend by this point was for Byzantium to gain ground at the expense of the Abbasids. This is because Byzantium was a lot better organized than the Abbasid Caliphate at this point, and they were able to keep fielding armies and keep really pushing and getting stuff done, whereas the Abbasids were a bit disunited and they were increasingly decentralized and unable to really fight back effectively. Another major consequence of the continued weakness of the Abbasid Caliphate is that one of their subordinate areas in the Caucasus broke away and formed a new Armenia. Now, back in antiquity, there had been an ancient Armenia, and now we're about to see the rise of the medieval instantiation of Armenia. This new independent and expansionist Armenia was recognized by the Arabs in 885. They had had little choice but to recognize it, and then by Byzantium a year after Basil's death in 887. So in many ways you could say that Basil's continued success in the east when piled on top of Michael III's had really weakened the Abbasids to the point where Armenia was able to break away and do its own thing. So that is one consequence of Byzantine expansion to the east. Now that we've taken a look at some of the political and military consequences of the decision of the council to give the Bulgarian church to Byzantium, let's go back to the overall issue of religion under Basil I and take a look at the larger competition for influence over the Slavs that took place between the Eastern and Western churches. The two major missionaries for the Eastern Orthodox Church were Cyril and Methodius, and they were able to reach out effectively to Slavic people living in Serbia, Macedonia, and Greece. However, the papacy was much more effective in areas like Croatia, Moravia, and the northern part of the Dalmatian coast. In part, the successes that Byzantine missions had led to the recall of Photius. Photius was an experienced theologian, and he was someone who could help formulate arguments that people could use against the Western Church to help spread Byzantine religious influence. So that is the context for Photius coming back, and also Cyril and Methodius, for all of their linguistic brilliance, were not quite as effective as missionaries as sometimes they are made out to be. Anyway, let's talk more about Photius now that he's back in play. Photius, of course, is no less than the eponymous subject of the Photian Schism. The real issue at play in the Photian Schism, however, is whether the emperor in Constantinople can appoint and dismiss the patriarchs of Constantinople without the Pope's approval. The Pope at the time, when Ignatius was first replaced by Photius, had thought that the Pope should have a say and should have supervision over the appointments of all archbishops, at least in theory, and when the Pope needed to intervene. However, for obvious reasons, the Byzantine emperors had disagreed, and that had led to the Photian Schism between the two churches. But interestingly enough, the person who would end up ending the Photian Schism was none other than the former patriarch and reason for the controversy, Photius. So how did that happen? Well, when Photius came back out of exile, he found that many of his supporters were still in positions of power, and to me this is further evidence that Basil's turn toward Ignatius and away from Photius was a political move to win over the papacy and win brownie points with the zealots at home. It had very little to do with any kind of change of heart on his part or the theology involved. In 874 or maybe 75, Basil appointed Photius to be the head of the University of the Magnara, and he was appointed to tutor Basil's sons. Getting to tutor the imperial sons was a great honor, and it's also a good choice since Photius was one of the most learned men of his day, and this would ensure that Basil's sons would receive education from one of the brightest men around. Ignatius, for his part, was old by this point, and when he died at age 80 in October of 877, Basil chose Photius to become patriarch for the second time. So both Ignatius and Photius served as patriarch twice, and both of them served in the same relationship to the other. So Ignatius served before and then after Photius, and Photius served before and after Ignatius. Or maybe after and before would be a slightly better phrasing. Anyway, a few years later, the Photian Schism will end because Pope John VIII will allow Photius to preside over a council that he gives his blessing to, and that basically just confirms the legitimacy of Photius and of the Byzantine emperor's ability to appoint whomever he pleased to be the Patriarch of Constantinople. Although, once again, there was still room for argumentation, since obviously the second time was different, since the patriarchal throne had been vacated by death, and so there was obviously room for the Pope to backtrack on this issue later, or for a future Pope to backtrack, but for now things were settled and everything looked hunky-dory. Although Photius was a major figure under a few different emperors, I feel that he reached both his high point and his low point during the time of Basil I, so I feel it's only fitting to briefly mention just how important Photius was to the course and recording of Byzantine history. He was an accomplished intellectual and writer who had once visited Baghdad as an ambassador, and he had probably visited the Great Library at Baghdad during that time and learned something from that experience. Photius wrote a voluminous correspondence to foreign rulers and religious officials, so he was internationally famous and someone who had quite a few connections around the world. He also was the primary or one of the primary architects of the expansionist policies of the Byzantine state and church that the empire would follow over the next couple centuries. He wrote 3 major works which held a lot of influence. The first work that he wrote was called The Library, and this is basically just Photius looking at all of the books that he's read and then writing a brief summary of them. So this is useful for a couple reasons. First, we can see what texts were available to someone like Photius in the 9th century. The other thing is we get summaries of some texts that we don't have anymore, so we have a general idea of what those texts had or were about. So that way, if we happen to find some random fragments of something in Greek, we might be able to identify it based on Photius's annotated bibliography. Another major work of Photius is the Lexicon. This is basically Photius's attempt to make a dictionary of terms that he found to be interesting or controversial in some way. And the idea here is that if he found a word to be interesting, he would write a whole entry on what it meant and all of the various implications of that meaning. So this is another interesting work, and it gives us some insight into how a 9th century theologian's brain worked. We also have a work by him called Mystagogy of the Holy Spirit, and this is a more purely theological tract and something that again gives us some insight into 9th century Byzantine theology. So Photius was a major figure, and he was at various times supported by and opposed by Basil I. One of Basil's other major accomplishments while he was on the throne was initiating a complete reform of Justinian's law code while incorporating supplements from more recent times. This larger law project of completely revamping Justinian's law code was never completely finished. However, there were 2 works that were published within Basil's lifetime, and these works were still important. The Prochiron was published in the 870s, and this was an updated legal handbook for daily use by lawyers and judges. The Apanagoge was published a bit later, and this was more focused on legal theory, and it specifically is important for laying out the secular and sacred division of power in the Byzantine world between the emperor and the patriarch. So both of these works were inspired by, or at least were commissioned because of, the orders of Basil. And you might be detecting a bit of a pattern here that is about to become apparent, that Basil really admired Justinian I and wanted to emulate him in various ways. Well, what else did Justinian do other than try to conquer Italy and make a law code? If you guessed he built a lot of shit, then you guessed correctly. So let's look at what Basil did as a builder. I guess that one way to describe Basil's building activities is that he was something of a renovator in chief. One of the major renovation projects that he and his 2 successors undertook was to really restore the power and reputation of the Byzantine fleet. As we saw earlier, it was already restored sufficiently early in Basil's reign for him to be able to send it to help out the Holy Roman Empire. However, later on, this fleet would regain even more of its former glory, and by the end of Basil's reign, the Byzantine fleet would once again be the dominant fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean. So that was important. And this is also another interesting case of where Basil took up the work being done by Michael and managed to take most of the credit for it. And by Michael, of course, I most likely mean Bardas. But anyway, in addition to that, Basil was big into building things where it would be obvious that he had had a hand in building these things, and that it would prove to future generations that he had been a great man and a great patron of the empire. So because of this, one of his projects that we know about for sure is that he renovated all of the imperial palaces. And we don't know exactly what else he built, but it seems like he was pretty prolific. He certainly had a reputation as quite a builder. The problem for Basil, the sad truth, is that of all the things that he built or renovated, none of them survive to the present in a form that would enable us to really appreciate or get a sense of what Basil's buildings and renovations were like. So we only know of him as a great builder solely by reputation. We have no examples to point to, and there's nowhere you could visit where you could learn more about Basil I being a great builder. So that's sad, but again, at least we do know that he built a lot of stuff. So I guess there's a silver lining there somewhere. From his seizure of power in 867 until 879, Basil seems to have enjoyed more or less unbroken good fortune. He had been able to avoid any kind of challenge from one of the Amorians, and he was doing well. The empire was prospering under his leadership, and he was really cementing his new dynasty. However, in September of 879, Basil suffered a terrible personal blow when his son Constantine dropped dead suddenly. By this point, Constantine would have been entering maturity. He was probably, I don't know, 30-ish, and he would have made for a good heir. However, this would never happen. And this is something that Basil was never able to get past. He really withdrew into himself, became more paranoid, and he viewed this not, mysteriously, as a form of divine retribution for the things that he had done earlier in his life when he had murdered his best friend and taken over the empire. Now, for his part, the patriarch Photius did not like Leo, and he tried to play to Basil's dislike of his son. What were Leo's actual faults, though? It's really hard to see why Photius hated him so much. Leo had a bit of a temper and he liked to womanize, but otherwise he was a pretty promising prince. And after Constantine's death, he was really the only option. Yet Photius would constantly try to provoke tension between father and son. At one point, Basil and his son feuded over Leo keeping a mistress. If you want to learn all of the details of that, then you can check out my patron-only video. Later on, Basil suspected Leo of conspiring against him and threw him in prison for a few months, and nearly had him blinded for an imagined conspiracy which didn't actually exist. Ultimately, however, though, father and son were able to get along just well enough that Basil did not kill his second son. And that was something that ended up being good for the empire. So I guess Basil deserves some credit for that. But suffice to say that his last years from 879 to 886 were not happy ones. The empire may have been doing well overall, but Basil was not in good shape. And his mind and his heart were pretty riven by Constantine's death, and he never came anywhere close to recovering from that experience. As I mentioned earlier, Basil was a devoted hunter, and he was also someone who enjoyed great physical vigor throughout his life. So even if his emotional life was totally wrecked in 879, his bodily health continued to hold out, and he was able to really throw himself into these physical hobbies after his son's death in order to keep himself distracted. So in the summer of 886, the then 74-year-old emperor was riding alone on a hunt. He had been with a party, but everyone else had gotten tired, and he had left them behind. And he had spotted a huge stag, so he charged after it, but after he got it cornered, the stag turned the tables, and Basil somehow got knocked out of his saddle, and he got dragged along by his horse for 16 miles. Obviously, there seems to be some exaggeration at play, since it would be almost impossible for anyone to be dragged for that long and still live. At any rate, Basil's hunting party soon figured out that something was wrong, and they finally managed to hunt him down and cut him loose. However, Basil at this point was deeply paranoid, so he ordered the man who had cut him loose to be put to death for raising a blade to the emperor. Later on, he was brought back to the palace. They found that he had a severe stomach hemorrhage, and he lingered for 9 days at the palace at Apamea before he died on August 29, 886. There are some really weird details to this hunting party and the people in it. For instance, one of the people in the party that found Basil was actually the father of Leo's mistress, someone who had a vested interest in not seeing Basil do well. At any rate, we'll get into more of those sordid details in the patron-only video. But suffice it to say for now that this is a very odd incident, and that it is possibly the most fitting end for someone like a Basil, because the end for him was completely and totally absurd, just like many of the major incidents in his life. And anyway, it's an interesting way to go. There are certainly worse ways to go than being an old man who charges after stags, gets dragged for 16 miles, has paranoid fits, and dies for massively overdoing it. Anyway, let's move on and talk about Basil I and his legacy. So, dramatics aside, what is the legacy of Basil I the Macedonian? I would say it's a legacy of success. Aside from his failure to disguise his own origins and the loss of Sicily, Basil I was highly successful as emperor across the board at every endeavor. His life and deeds also make him one of the most fascinating figures in Byzantine history. The Macedonian dynasty that Basil founded and really cemented presided over Byzantium at its peak, and its rulers are generally considered to be among the greatest rulers in the empire's history. Despite the fact that Basil himself was not a man who had received an education, his son, grandson, and many other members of the Macedonian dynasty went on to be highly regarded as thinkers and intellectuals. So Basil had a very positive legacy all the way around. Whatever the means by which he came to power, he did a lot of good with that power. So I think that that has to be taken in mind when we judge him. We shouldn't forget that this man was a cold-blooded murderer. However, he did probably improve the lives of many of his subjects through his actions. So if we believe that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, then you could actually make an argument that maybe Basil made the right decision when he decided to off his friend Michael and seize sole control. Anyway, let's not get into the morality of all of that. It doesn't really matter, but I think it's sometimes fun to consider. At any rate, this has been Basil I the Macedonian, and if you would like more content on Basil I, then once again, check out my previous video on Michael III, and also join me on Patreon as a supporter, and you can see more content on all of the various shenanigans that Basil the Macedonian got himself involved in. Anyhow, until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will see you around. In 886, Basil the Macedonian died, and he was succeeded by his son Leo, who earned the epithet the Wise. In Greek, the epithet is technically the most wise. And in this video, what I really want to look at is whether Leo's reputation for wisdom is truly deserved, or whether he is actually one of the more overrated emperors in the Byzantine tradition. So let's begin by looking at Leo's early life. Famously, Leo was not his father's favorite son. He was Basil I's second son, and he was the first son by Basil's second marriage to Eudocia and Gerena. However, there was a slight problem with Leo's pedigree, and that is that Eudocia and Gerena had been the mistress of Michael III, and there were rumors that Leo was actually Michael's son, and that he had been conceived prior to Michael's death. Most likely this rumor is not actually true, but it is one that persisted and was repeated in later sources as well. Leo had an older half-brother named Constantine, and he had two younger brothers named Stephen and Alexander. We don't really have a lot of details on what Leo's relationship with his brothers or his mother was like, although I will be making a video soon on Alexander, so you can learn more about their relationship in that video. For now, let's consider Leo's relationship with his father, Basil I. Basil was apparently not an easy father, and Leo's early years were shaped by his conflict with his father. Leo had been officially associated with the throne since 870. However, Basil had an older son named Constantine from a previous marriage, and his hope had always been that Constantine would be his eventual heir apparent. However, Constantine ended up dying in 879, and this forced Basil to make Leo the heir apparent. And it seems that in his grief, Basil sort of held a grudge against Leo for replacing his beloved Constantine. And this would lead to considerable and constant friction between father and son. I imagine it was exacerbated by the fact that they had very different personalities. Basil had made sure that his children received a top-notch education, and Leo had really gone deep into scholarship. Both of them shared a love of women and all that kind of stuff, but that apparently served as no kind of bond. We don't really hear about Leo being really big into hunting or all the other passions that Basil had, so they didn't really have a lot of areas they could bond in. When he was 15 years old, Leo actually took up a mistress named Zoe, and this caused quite a stir because this is a young man who is already taking up a mistress, and people started to ask Basil if his son was some sort of reprobate or degenerate. So Basil, to avoid scandal, made Zoe go away from the court, had her married to some minor official, and then forced Leo to marry a girl named Theophano, who was someone who had well-established piety. The picture to your left is actually a drawing of Leo and his wife Theophano attending church. There was another point where Leo was carrying a knife on him in Basil's presence, and Basil had him imprisoned for it. And this was at a point when Leo and Theophano already had an infant daughter, and this was toward the end of Basil's reign. This was something that was pretty traumatic for Leo. He was imprisoned for several months before Basil finally let him go and then restored him to his former prerogatives. So you can imagine for Leo, life was fraught with danger of being accused of plotting horrible things. And of course, when your father's the emperor, his paranoia can lead to your death. So this was something that would have been a major struggle for Leo throughout his teenage years. While I don't want to get too far sidetracked, I would like to propose the possibility, at least, that Leo had a hand in Basil's death. If you'll recall the circumstances of Basil's death, it was a hunting accident where he somehow fell out of his saddle, got dragged for miles, and then had to be cut out of his saddle. And a lot of the things that happened were, to say the least, odd and unusual, not the least of which is that he was riding alone, supposedly. So my suspicion is that it's at least possible that Leo had something to do with this. One of the pieces of circumstantial evidence is that one of the officials who was present when Basil died was Stylianos Zaltzes, the father of Leo's mistress Zoe. At this time, as I mentioned earlier, Leo felt under pressure from his father. He had just recently been imprisoned. He was 20 years old, and he had two younger brothers, both of whom were now teenagers. This meant that Leo was not, strictly speaking, indispensable. I mean, granted, his second oldest brother, Stephen, was rather sickly, but still, Leo was not someone who couldn't be done without. So he had every reason to fear his brother's coming of age. And since his father was still out hunting and being very physically active, there was no reason for Leo to think that Basil was going to die anytime soon. So it actually made quite a bit of sense if Leo were to have been involved. However, of course, this is unprovable, and Leo was not at the hunt, so this is somewhat speculative, but I just think it is somewhat interesting to think about. The year is now 886, and Leo VI is the full emperor of the Byzantine world. He was 20 years old, he was married to Theophano, and he had a daughter. While his marriage to Theophano was not a happy one, it was clearly a successful one, since she had already given birth to a child and could easily give birth to a male child at some point. So Leo had every reason to stick with her and to push forward trying to sire a male heir. Officially, Leo still shared the throne with his younger brother Alexander, and that would be the case until Leo would eventually father a son. And again, this is something that he was planning on doing sooner rather than later. One of his first moves to try to surround himself with people who were amenable to his cause was to depose Patriarch Photius and elevate his brother Stephen in his place. Stephen became the youngest patriarch ever at age 19. And while you might think this would cause a stir within the church, it doesn't seem to have caused much of a stir, because it probably wasn't a huge surprise. Leo and Photius had been close at one point since Photius had been his tutor, but they had been butting heads ever since Leo discovered that he could keep a mistress. Photius had sided with Basil on both the mistress issue and again when Leo had been imprisoned by his father. So Leo had a bit of a grudge. However, there's another reason why Leo would want to sack Photius, and that's because Photius had a very expansive view of what the patriarch's powers should be. He essentially thought that the emperor and patriarch should be closer to equality than what Leo imagined, which is where the emperor has almost all of the power and the patriarch is merely a functionary who only controls the church and nothing beyond it. So there was a fundamental difference in governing philosophy as well as a personal grudge. So I don't think even Photius was too shocked when he was asked to leave office. Stylianos Zeuxis was still a good friend of Leo, and he became his chief advisor, serving both as Master of Offices and with the new title of Basiliopator. So these are the people who Leo is surrounding himself with in the early years, and in the case of Stylianos, he will stick around for several years. As a young emperor, Leo's reputation was as someone who was pious, hardworking, and learned. One of Leo's practices early on was to deliver sermons in the Hagia Sophia on days of great feast, and some of these speeches would include diatribes against loose women or describing adultery as deriving from animalistic instincts. Of course, he had already proven to be a hypocrite on the issue of loose women, and Zoe was probably not the only mistress that he had had up to that point. And later on, when it came to the whole adultery thing, by which he meant multiple marriages, serial monogamy, I guess you could call it, he, of course, would famously run into issues with that himself. Even while he was still a young man in his 20s, the breadth and depth of his knowledge, which pretty much encompassed every field, earned him the sobriquet of Sophotatos, the most wise. And of course, that has stuck with him. In English, most wise sounds weird, so we just call him Leo the Wise. So in many ways, his reputation was already set within the first 10 or so years that he was on the throne. When a new emperor came to power, there were a few different ways that he could try to establish his legitimacy and try to really cement himself as a competent governor. One was through military conquest, but Leo was not a soldier. Another was through enacting sweeping political reforms in the realm of policy. However, the empire was already fairly well governed when Leo came to power, so that didn't really seem like a great option. Two things that were left to him that he did capitalize on were one, symbolic gestures to establish his personality and character, and two, personnel changes that would put other people, fresh faces, into power and make sure that the people around him were loyal to him and not to his late father. So, along with his decision to depose Photius for Stephen, which is an example of shifting personnel, Leo also decided to have Michael III the Drunkard reinterred with full imperial honors. And of course, one of the effects of this is that it fueled rumors that Leo was in fact Michael's biological son. However, I think that Leo was actually trying to establish that his character was more generous and forgiving than that of his father. And by having Michael reinterred with honors, what he was showing is that he was above the fray, that he honored the entire history of his empire. Furthermore, if we're looking for a more personal motive for Leo to do this, aside from his hatred of his father and his need to sort of reverse something that he had done, we also have to remember that Leo is a scholar emperor rather than a soldier emperor. And one of the things that had been achieved under Michael was the Macedonian Renaissance. So the age of Michael might have been looked upon fondly by Leo and the people he associated with. So this was a way to sort of pay homage to that, while also trying to show the public in general that he's actually a good guy and that he will be fair-minded and above the fray. Another thing that Leo does where he continues a policy but puts a new spin on it is that he continues his father's recodification of the law. Now, Basil had ordered this project, but he himself was illiterate and so could only really supervise in the most rudimentary sense. Leo, of course, was one of the foremost scholars of his day, so he actually could work on this project personally, review it in a meaningful way, and find people to work on it who were competent scholars. So Leo would make sure that he put his personal stamp on this project, and he also gave a lot of insight and direction to it. So even though it was technically Basil's idea, Leo earned an even half of the credit just because of the amount of work that he put into this project. The law code commissioned by Basil and finished by Leo is known as the Basilica. While it might look like something that was named after Basil, that is not the case. It is actually derived from the Greek words for royal laws. The project was an update in Greek of Justinian's code from the 6th century. Justinian's code had been written in Latin, and Latin was something that was not known to many of the officials in the Eastern Empire. So by putting the code into Greek, this is something that made it more accessible to the governing class. Not only that, but since this reorganized the laws, it incorporated laws that had been passed since the time of Justinian. And Leo himself, after finishing the Basilica, added more new laws that he called novels to this body of work. And that system of adding novels would prove to be an enduring one that would go on. The work as a whole was completed in 892, and I think really this is the greatest achievement of Leo VI. This is where all of his strengths as a ruler came into play, and this was his most lasting achievement as well. Leo's consistent political program was to centralize power in his own hands at the expense of other institutions and of the aristocracy. We've already seen that one of the reasons why Photius went down is because he was in favor of enhancing the power of the patriarch. In novels 46, 47, and 78, Leo curtailed the powers of the Curia and the Senate, neither of which was actually that powerful to begin with. The Senate was not completely crippled or abolished, however, and it continued to meet and advise Leo. In 912, Leo thought it sufficiently worth his time to officially entrust the Senate to care for his son. Actually, there's a lot of scholarship now that's really calling into question the idea that the Senate in Byzantium was completely useless. I'll have to acquaint myself with that scholarship and maybe make a video on the role of the Senate. But for now, I'm just not convinced that the Senate was all that impactful on a day-to-day basis in Byzantium. Leo also made some smaller reforms to tighten his control over the aristocracy, and that would be sort of a long-term general trend throughout the Macedonian dynasty period, where the emperors would be trying to rein in the aristocrats on the frontier, and they would have varying success doing it, but of course the person who was the best at it was actually Basil II. However, that is still a long way off. While Leo's early years were pretty successful in terms of his performance as emperor, he had a lot of problems as a husband and family man. He and his wife Theophano had never really loved each other. Theophano made a lot of efforts to win Leo's affection early on. She stayed in prison with him when he was thrown into jail by his father, but he had never really warmed up to her. He still resented her because she was foisted upon him by his dad, and of course he always had hated his father. And that coldness eventually drove Theophano away and led her to become increasingly religious and interested in asceticism. And one of the results of that, the most important result, is that this led to a sexless marriage. And of course, without sex, there was not very much possibility of producing a male heir. In 893, Theophano decided that it was time to retire from the palace and live in a convent This is something that she had been wanting to do for a long time. She had been donating money to monasteries for years, and she ended up passing away in late 897. At the time when Theophano left, Leo seems to have been quite happy and relieved, and he brought his mistress Zoe back. She had just recently been widowed after her husband died, which of course has led a few people to speculate maybe Leo had a hand in that death too. And of course, once Theophano is dead, Zoe can now become the new empress. So in 897, maybe early 898, they are married. And while there is a little bit of pushback from the church, it's kind of understood that Leo and Zoe had always been a thing, and that Leo needed to sire a male heir. So this was not a big deal, but it did sort of send up some warning flags a bit, and it sort of presaged some problems that were going to come. Leo's early reign was a relatively peaceful time, at least insofar as it was free from any major wars with one of the major empires. There were constant fights with the Arabs in the Aegean Sea, especially against the Emirate of Crete, and there was constant fighting in Sicily, where the new emirate there was trying to drive out the remaining Byzantine forces, but for the most part, Byzantium was not engaged in a pitched do-or-die war. However, in 893, Simeon rose to the Bulgarian throne. At first, no one really paid much attention. He had not been the heir apparent, and he doesn't seem to have inspired any kind of fear or anxiety in Constantinople. Simeon had actually attended lessons in Constantinople. He had attended the lessons of Photius alongside of Leo. He had been there for some kind of church training, but then he had been recalled to his homeland and had eventually risen to the throne. Stylianos Zaltzes, who was always loyal to Leo and tried to govern in his best interest, sometimes did things that were shady, where he would enrich himself or his friends, and that meant playing pay-to-play politics. And while for the most part these little acts of corruption didn't have an outsized impact on the empire's fortunes as a whole, there is one instance where Stylianos picked a fight by his pay-to-play politics that had long-reaching implications for the Byzantine Empire and for Leo's success as an emperor. And we're about to see how that happened. In 894, Stylianos' corruption would cause a major rift with Bulgaria. That year, Stylianos awarded a monopoly of trade with Bulgaria, one of Byzantium's major trading partners, to two of his protégés, and they decided that they wanted to make bank off of this contract. So they immediately increased import duties on Bulgarian merchants and then shifted the market for Bulgarian merchants from Constantinople to Thessalonica. There are a number of disadvantages this imposed. One, Thessalonica is a much smaller market, so it's harder to sell things. Two, it's harder to access because it's harder to get to by sea, especially if you're coming from the north. And three, because it is at a remove from the capital, if there are abuses going on by these officials, then it is harder to really prove that these are abuses to the other authorities who might be able to do something about it. So this was a major grievance. These merchants brought their grievance to their king, Simeon, and he, of course, then brought it to the emperor, Leo. When Simeon sent his embassy to protest, Leo ended up backing up Stylianos because, of course, he trusted Stylianos to act in his best interest, and he thought that this move must have been one made in good faith and one which was good for his realm. Simeon was not pleased by this response, and he resolved upon war. For whatever reason, Leo did not think that Simeon would resort to war over this abuse, and he was caught completely off guard. His armies were not ready, and there were not many troops in position to defend against an attack from the north. Qui-Gon Jinn having failed to resolve the trade dispute, this resulted in war, and of course the Bulgarians under Simeon launched the first attack. At this time, Byzantium's forces were out of place. The best armies were either in the east or they were fighting in Sicily and southern Italy. This has been where most of the fighting had been occurring for decades at this point. Leo needed a good general, so he recalled his general Nicephorus Phocas and placed him in command of a hastily formed army that he recruited especially for the purpose of dealing with the Bulgarian invasion. Meanwhile, however, Leo needed help immediately, so what he did was to try to create pressure in Simeon's rear. He managed to make an alliance with the Magyars, who were then living in Moldavia and Transylvania, which means that they were to the direct north of the Bulgarians. Simeon was forced to abandon his invasion, and copying what Leo had done, he allied himself with the Pechenegs to the north of the Magyars, and they were able to hit the Magyars in the rear. The Magyars were then forced to abandon their homeland and move west into what is now modern Hungary. And this, of course, is the sort of origin story of the formation of what later becomes Hungary. However, while this did buy Leo some time, it did not completely abate the wrath of Simeon, and he would soon return to really seek his revenge and take a chunk out of Byzantium. By 896, Simeon had sufficiently secured his rear, and he was able to resume the offensive against Byzantium. It appears that the Byzantines had overestimated the impact that their Magyar distraction would have, and they didn't seem to take Simeon's threat as seriously as they should have. For reasons unknown, possibly due to jealousy or some other reason, Stylianos had decided to recall Nicephorus Phocas to the capital, and in his place he had left the general Catacaulon in charge. Catacaulon was not a good general. He was someone who was vastly inferior to Nicephorus Phocas, and this would of course become a problem since it would be Catacaulon who would have to fight against Simeon in pitched battle. At the Battle of Bulgaro-Phygon, most of Catacaulon's army was annihilated, with only Catacaulon himself and a few others escaping. Of course, this created a massive power vacuum, and there was no army between Simeon and Constantinople. According to Al-Tabari, Leo was forced to resort to recruiting Arab POWs in order to form a hastily conceived army and check Simeon's progress toward Constantinople. Whether that's true or not is hard to say, but the desperation of the situation does suggest that something like that would have been needed to really get the Byzantines to stabilize the situation in the Balkans. After 5 years of negotiations between Leo and Simeon, they finally reached an agreement where Leo was forced to agree to pay a substantial tribute, reverse Stylianos' trade policy, and cede a considerable chunk of territory along the Black Sea, while also recognizing Serbian independence in the Western Balkans. So this was a great weakening of Byzantium's position in the Balkans. Many decades, even a couple centuries of work in the Balkans had been undone in one single war. And for that alone, Simeon earned his title of the Great. That is something that many of his predecessors had only dreamt of doing, and Simeon was able to pull it off. And when we think about this larger issue of whether Leo is overrated, I think that we can compare him to his contemporary Simeon and see that he falls short in terms of what he accomplished as a ruler. Here is a depiction of the Battle of Bulgaro-Phygon as it appeared in a manuscript from Madrid. This is a large image, and I figured it didn't fit well in a slide with other text, so I figured I'd just let you take a good look at it on its own. While Leo was engaged in difficult negotiations with Simeon, he did get one piece of good news. His first wife Theophano died in her monastery in November of 897, and that freed Leo up to marry his longtime mistress and true love, Zoe Zaltzes. This was important for reasons of state, since Leo still had no male heir, and Zoe could give him one, whereas Theophano had become ascetic and given up sex altogether. The pair was married in early 898, and they had 2 daughters together. Many people have speculated, probably correctly, that this would have been the happiest time of Leo's life. At long last, he was free to be with the woman he loved, the woman he had chosen as a teenager, and they were finally married. However, it would prove to be a short-lived period of happiness. While the couple did manage to have 2 daughters together, things sort of went south but due to illness. In early 898, Zoe's father Stylianos, who had long been Leo's chief advisor, died. Now, Leo and Stylianos had had some friction since about 894 or so with the outbreak of the Byzantine-Bulgarian War. However, they had remained close-ish, and Stylianos had continued to be a major part of the government. With Stylianos gone, Leo would have to turn to other people to help him manage the empire. Then at the end of 899, a far worse blow befell Leo when Zoe fell ill and died. She had been the love of his life, and he had hoped that she would be the one to give him a son. Now, without a son and without a wife, Leo found himself 33 years old and needing to seek a third marriage, which would be something that would prove to be controversial, even if far from impossible. The problem with Leo's third marriage is that the patristic tradition in the Greek East was for the church fathers to oppose taking third wives and to set the limit on how many wives a man could take at 2. However, Leo being a learned and clever man, he was able to find precedents for third marriages among the Western fathers who wrote in Latin: Jerome, Ambrose, Augustine. And the patriarch in 900 was still Stephen. He was reaching the end of his life, but he was still there, and Stephen could go up to bat for Leo. Not to mention that Stephen's replacement, Nicholas Mysticus, was at the time an ally of Leo and would be someone who would be willing to play ball to a certain degree, although not quite as far as Stephen had gone. In 900, having grieved sufficiently for his lost Zoe, Leo decided to hold a bride show, and this proved to be the last attested bride show in Byzantine history. At this bride show, Leo selected the beautiful Eudocia Baiana to be his third wife. At the time, Leo was convinced that this would be his last ever shot at marriage and the siring of a male heir. Even third marriages were viewed as moderated fornication, meaning that he was living in sin, although it was legal. And he thought that the third time would have to be a charm, otherwise he and the empire with it would be in deep trouble. Unfortunately for Leo, the third time was not a charm. Eudocia Baiana duly got pregnant, and she gave birth to a son on April 12, 901, which was Easter Sunday, but she ended up dying in the process. Leo then attempted to have her buried at the monastery of St. Lazarus, but the abbot there refused because he was horrified that she was his third wife, he of course being someone who was heavily influenced by the Eastern Church Fathers and who had not quite accepted Leo's argument based on the Western Church Fathers. A few days after being born, Leo's infant son also passed away. So had the infant son survived but the mother died, it would have been an acceptable situation. But as it was, Leo was now in deep trouble. He had no son and heir, but at the same time, he was out of marriages. He had tried and failed 3 times to produce a male offspring. At this time, he's also still fairly young. He's in his mid-30s. He has proven fertility. He's fathered several daughters. So this is frustrating, and Leo is going to be looking for a way to get around the rules of the church that are impeding his ability to ensure the empire's long-term stability. The combination of the shifting away of forces from Italy in order to help defend against the Bulgarians, the recall of Nicephorus Phocas, and the heavy financial burden placed by the tribute that Leo now had to pay to Simeon weakened his frontier defenses across the board. The first and most dramatic instance of this came on August 1st, 902, when the city of Taormina, the last imperial stronghold on Sicily, fell to the local Arab emirate. That same year, Byzantine forces in the east in Armenia and Cilicia were also losing ground. To see how weakened Byzantium was by the defeat at the hands of the Bulgarians, it's important to note that Byzantium was never able to reestablish a foothold in Sicily. They had controlled Sicily since the time of Justinian and Belisarius, and they would never again control anything on the island. In the Aegean Sea, an Arab fleet managed to capture the well-defended port of Demetrios in Thessaly. This also occurred in 902. So essentially, Leo's great defeat at the hands of the Bulgarians had really emboldened his enemies while also weakening his ability to defend himself or to strike back. In time, the Byzantines would recover, but for now they were pretty weak. One can only imagine Leo's mental state at a time when he was failing to produce an heir, he was in trouble with his own church, and he was losing battles on his frontiers. Although 902 had been a rough enough year for Leo and his empire, 904 would prove to be worse. That year, Leo of Tripoli arrived in the Aegean with a large fleet from Syria and threatened Constantinople. Leo had been someone who had been born as a Greek, and then he had converted to Islam and risen through the ranks to become a great admiral of the Arabs who lived in Syria. He would prove to be a thorn in Leo's side for the rest of his reign. When Eustathius, the Drungarius or admiral-in-chief, lost his nerve and refused to engage the Arab fleet, Leo had him replaced with Himerius, the uncle of his mistress and someone who would become Leo's most trusted functionary for the rest of his reign. Leo had a definite pattern of seeking out the father of the woman that he cared for the most, and this pattern would continue. Luckily, both of the men Leo selected in this way turned out to be relatively capable gentlemen. Himerius was able to drive off the Arab fleet after a short battle, but rather than turning home as expected, Leo of Tripoli instead diverted from his expected course and hit Thessalonica. Thessalonica was able to hold out for 3 days, however, the city fell to assault. The reason being the defenses were unprepared, since no one thought that a fleet was coming in to attack the city, and there were 2 commanders in charge of the city who were in the middle of a feud and who were not cooperating. One of the commanders died on the 2nd day of the siege, so they did eventually get a unified command structure, but it came too little too late to make a difference. The fall of Thessalonica was an unmitigated catastrophe. It was the 2nd city of the empire, and by the time Leo left after a week of looting, the city itself was in ruins, 30,000 citizens were carried off as captives, and this was a major blow to Leo's prestige and to the notion that he was capable of defending the empire effectively. Leo knew that he could not let the fall of Thessalonica go unavenged, so the next year he organized a great expedition under Himerius to do to the city of Tarsus what Leo of Tripoli had done to Thessalonica. At this time, Tarsus was a fairly major city, approximately the same size as Thessalonica, and it was the capital of the emirate of Tarsus. Himerius's original plan was to sail with a large land force, land it, turn it over to the general Andronicus Ducas, and stay with the fleet. However, in the event, a couple of things happened which made that not work. First of all, Himerius was attacked by Leo of Tripoli. He managed to defeat the Arab fleet, apparently decisively, and then when Andronicus Ducas failed to show up, Himerius decided to lead his own forces without the local reinforcements and just go straight at Tarsus. The campaign was a success. Himerius managed to capture the city, sack it, take many prisoners, including the Emir of Tarsus, and then successfully make it back home. Leo was then able to use these prisoners as exchange bait for the captured citizens of Thessalonica, and this enabled him to more or less restore his 2nd city. While on paper it may seem that Leo had just restored his city and only gotten back to where he had been before the sack of the city, he actually probably came out a little bit ahead insofar as the sack of Tarsus destabilized the emirate there and caused it to collapse, leading to some small Byzantine gains in the area. So overall, Leo came out a little bit better than he had started. However, the city of Thessalonica would take some time to get back to what it had been. As I mentioned earlier, the original plan had been for Himerius to hand over his ground forces to the local governor Andronicus Ducas, but Ducas had instead refused to cooperate and then marched his men north to Iconium, sitting out the entire campaign. So let's talk more about Andronicus Ducas, because he's a fairly fascinating figure, and he is typically regarded as being emblematic of the rise of great military families which strove to establish their own independence from the throne as much as possible. Ducas himself was a highly accomplished general who had raided Syria in 904. He was effectively the first responder to the sack of Thessalonica, and the Emperor Leo held him in high esteem. That's why he was sending him reinforcements, and he wanted Ducas to be the man to lead the expedition against Tarsus. Ducas also hailed from the Ducas clan, which was one of the most powerful families in the entire empire. It's very possible that Ducas's betrayal was more or less a grievance over being placed under the command of an inferior, and even then there may have been a misunderstanding on Andronicus's part about what role he would play in the campaign. It's clear that Leo intended for Andronicus to take command of the forces Himerius was bringing to him, but maybe Andronicus misinterpreted all this as him being placed under the command of Himerius. Anyway, it was most likely an aristocratic pride problem, and after the expedition succeeded against the expectations of Ducas, he decided that he needed to flee across the frontier in order to avoid being executed for treason. However, Leo was forgiving and understanding. He understood this had been just a big misunderstanding. So he decided to send an offer of reinstatement to Andronicus, who was living at the court of one of the emirs. Unfortunately for Leo and Andronicus, this missive was intercepted and then misinterpreted. When the emir heard about the letter, his assumption was that it was all a big ruse and that Andronicus was there as a spy, and that he was just gathering information so that he could lead another expedition at this emir's expense. So he gave Andronicus a choice. He could either convert to Islam and essentially live there under house arrest, or he could be executed. Andronicus chose to convert, and then he lived under house arrest for a few years and died. We can also see that Leo was not upset at the Ducas clan in general, because Constantine, his son, was able to take over his estate, inherit his position, and remain a major player in the Byzantine world. So major, in fact, that at one point, one of the patriarchs will suggest that they get rid of Constantine VII and replace him with Constantine Ducas. Anyway, let's get back to our main narrative. In general, what we see in Leo's reign is that he lost ground in the west, he lost ground in the Balkans, and in the Aegean. However, if we look at what he accomplished in the east, his record is far better. In addition to sacking the cities of Theodosiopolis and Tarsus, Leo was also able to establish a new theme of Mesopotamia, which greatly enhanced Byzantium's control over the region. There's evidence that the Byzantines already had some degree of control in that area. This is the area highlighted in dark purple on the map. But this control was not direct, and it may have even been through sort of Armenian client princes. But Leo decided to establish direct control. This theme of Mesopotamia would continue to exist until 1071, when, in the wake of the great defeat at Manzikert, the Byzantines found themselves unable to maintain both this theme and most of the other themes in the east. And this theme, of course, would therefore be one of Leo's most lasting achievements. After the death of his third wife, Leo decided to take up another mistress. Her name is Zoe Carbonopsina. Carbonopsina means with eyes black like coal. She apparently was very famous for her eyes and her beauty in general. And she was the niece of one of the prominent admirals in Leo's fleet, Himerius. We've already seen Himerius. He took over for Eustathius, and he defeated Leo of Tripoli and then sacked Tarsus. Earlier, I may have said that Himerius was Zoe's father. That's actually inaccurate. He is the uncle. So consider that a correction. Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus, who had succeeded Stephen in 901, was mostly an ally of Leo, and he was willing to overlook Leo keeping a mistress, since he understood the need to sire an heir, and he also understood that Leo was someone with a relatively high sex drive who probably couldn't live celibate, at least not at his age. So the idea that Leo has here is that he will work out of wedlock to produce an heir, and if a male heir should be born, then he would marry the woman and adopt the son. It was a pretty good plan, and I'm not really sure exactly how much of it the Patriarch understood. The Patriarch may have just thought that this was Leo's way to get his rocks off. I don't know. At any rate, though, Zoe gave Leo 2 more daughters, and then in May of 905, after they had been together for a few years, they had a son later named Constantine. This is what Leo had been hoping for literally his entire adult life, and now it had finally come to pass. Which leads to the problem of how do you legitimate this relationship and get Constantine to become the heir to the empire. Now the real fight between Leo and the church would begin in earnest, and his private life would merge completely with his public life. For Leo, the first priority was to try to get Constantine to be legitimized and recognized as the heir apparent to the empire. However, the birth of Constantine put Nicholas in a precarious position, since he knew that a fourth marriage was completely out of the question. He knew, however, that because Constantine was sickly and possibly would die as an infant, that his father was greatly concerned to make sure that the boy was baptized and that he would be in good standing with the church in the event of his death. So Nicholas got Leo to agree to send Zoe away from the palace, i.e. quit living in sin, in exchange for baptizing young Constantine. Leo agreed, and the boy was baptized. However, as soon as the baptism was over, Leo brought Zoe back to the palace, and it's not really clear if he did so publicly or secretly, but we have to imagine that given the nature of gossip around any kind of royal court, that the Patriarch was aware within a few days. While Constantine had now been accepted by the church, he was still considered a bastard, and the only way for him to become legitimate would be for Leo and Zoe to get married. But that seemed like it was out of the question, so Leo had to figure out a way to make that happen, despite all of the odds being against it. Knowing that he couldn't rely upon Nicholas to give him his desired outcome, i.e. recognizing his marriage and fully legitimizing his son, Leo decided to work around Nicholas and present him with an accomplished marriage. So what he did was find a local small-time priest who was willing to preside over a wedding, and in a private ceremony he and Zoe were married. Shortly after their marriage, Leo publicly announced that Zoe was now the Empress of the realm. This, of course, did not go without quite a bit of opposition from both Patriarch Nicholas and others within the church. Nicholas at this time was under immense pressure to stop this outrage. A fourth marriage was considered adultery outright, and he publicly criticized Leo for reneging on their agreement. When Leo would try to attend the Hagia Sophia, Nicholas would turn him away and send him home. Leo complied in public with Nicholas's decision. However, he was not happy about it, and he would not tolerate this for long. So how did he manage to find a way around the Patriarch's disapproval? Leo was a learned theologian in his own right. However, it would not be his knowledge of church doctrine that would get him through this crisis, but rather just horse trading politics and understanding the nature of power and factionalism. There was an old partisan divide of zealots and politicians that in recent years had given way to a divide between Photians and Ignatians. Photians were a scholarly, worldly group of people who were really into learning. Leo had associated with them for his entire reign, therefore they were in the ascendant. And because of the need to debate at church councils, if all of the most learned people are on one side, they tend to win a lot, especially if the emperor is also on their side. It's not even a fair contest. The Ignatians only gained a major ally when the bishop Erethus joined them over the fourth marriage issue. Although, to be fair, Erethus did not join them over that issue so much as because he held a grudge against Nicholas. And that grudge stemmed from, of all things, the Ignatians trying to put Erethus on trial for atheism due to things that he said in one of his commentaries on the book of Revelation. And Erethus had thought that Nicholas, who was his friend, would go after the Ignatians when he came to power the year after his trial, However, Nicholas decided to be more of a conciliator, and he didn't have any interest in starting a church civil war. So Arethusa was angry at Nicholas and decided to seek his revenge. Whenever we look at any of these religious conflicts, we have to remember that all of these great bishops were themselves aristocrats, and they all had very sensitive egos. These egos would be just as important, if not more so, than their theological convictions. And in the case of this debate, the ego wars would prove to be more decisive and more important. Leo decided to also turn to the Ignatian faction, which was a surprising move given that the Ignatians had been associated with the defunct Zealot party, which had always been more or less opposed to the throne, at least in terms of letting the throne do what it wanted. So this was something that was surprising if you weren't paying close attention and you didn't realize that Leo's number one overriding priority was to get his son recognized as the next emperor. There was a person he could turn to in the Ignatian camp, someone who had been one of his spiritual mentors as a young man, the abbot Euthemius. And in exchange for the patriarchal throne, Euthemius agreed to recognize the fourth marriage. It was more or less a quid pro quo, even though Euthemius, of course, played the pious man who had deep concerns for Leo's spiritual well-being and for the purity of church doctrine. He said that in order to pull this off, he would need approval from a higher authority, i.e. the Pope. Euthemius and many of the Ignatians believed in papal supremacy. One of the reasons why the crown of Byzantium and the Photians had always been allies is because they both agreed that the Patriarch's authority should be equal to or greater than that of the Pope, and that the Emperor and the Patriarch should run the show in the East without any input from the West. So Leo effectively was willing to diminish some of the authority of the Eastern Church in exchange for getting what he needed. And Euthemius, who felt the Pope should be supreme, was willing to play along with that. Then Leo made a move that would have been stunning to everyone who wasn't in on this, meaning everyone outside of Euthemius, when he asked Pope Sergius III for permission to have a fourth marriage, and then appealed to Sergius again to justify his decision to replace Nicholas with Euthemius. Sergius III, being a good pope, was happy to oblige. The goal of pretty much every pope ever was to enhance the authority of the papacy. And by setting a precedent where the pope could grant a fourth marriage to the emperor of Byzantium, that was something that any future pope could use as a precedent in order to impose their will upon secular princes. Further, with the fall of Sicily and the Arab invasion of southern Italy, the pope needed all the troops he could get. So the only person he could really turn to for help in that regard would be Leo. So the move from the Pope's perspective made 100% sense, and there was no real possibility that he would say no. Our most famous image of Leo comes from the Hagia Sophia, where there's a mosaic of him bent down in penitence before Jesus. And the reason why this is an image is because Leo was forced to attend church for the rest of his life as a penitent. He was officially a sinner for having a fourth marriage, and he was not allowed to sit during church services. He had to stand. However, that was a small price to pay for getting what he needed to keep the empire going and keeping his dynasty on the throne. His son, Constantine VII, despite being sickly as an infant, proved to strengthen up over time, and he was officially crowned as co-emperor on May 15th, 908, when he was about 3 years old. There were also other things for Leo to be satisfied with. Himerius continued to provide excellent service. In 910, he sacked the Syrian port of Laodicea. He then plundered the Syrian countryside and returned home loaded with loot without having lost a single ship. In ancient naval combat, going without losing a ship to a storm, some sort of shoal, enemy action, or some other cause was almost unheard of. So that indeed was worthy of celebration. However, while things had been turning in the positive direction for Leo over the last several years, his actual end would not prove to be quite so happy. Since the 820s, Muslim exiles from Andalusia had established the Emirate of Crete. The Emirate of Crete effectively served as a pirate base and both harmed imperial trade and threatened imperial coastal possessions. So Leo's thinking was that if he were able to capture the island for the empire, that he could prevent another disaster like Demetrios or Thessalonica. Accordingly, in 911, he and Himerius organized the strongest expedition yet to Crete. However, after 6 months, even Himerius was unable to make progress. The Muslims of Crete were quite well entrenched by this point. They had made their defenses formidable, and Himerius was kind of pulling his hair out trying to figure out how to dislodge them. However, his worries proved to be misplaced, since the real problem lay elsewhere, back in Constantinople. In early 912, Leo fell ill, and knowing that this would be his last illness, Leo sent for Himerius and recalled the Cretan expedition. So Himerius took his forces, embarked them, and set sail for home. However, before the fleet got back to Constantinople, they were sailing in the area around Chios, and then they were attacked by Leo of Tripoli. And this time, unlike the previous battles between Himerius and Leo of Tripoli emerged victorious, shattering Himerius's fleet. Himerius himself and a few of his ships were able to escape, but for the most part, the fleet was smashed. The news of this defeat was one of the last things that Leo heard. He heard it probably the same day that he died, on May 11th, 912. So not only did Leo die without accomplishing his last great strategic move, but he also lost a fleet, and his chief admiral was discredited in the process. The question that I posed at the beginning of this video is whether Leo is the most wise or the most overrated of the Byzantine emperors. And in conclusion, it's complicated. In later times, Leo's reputation for wisdom rose to the point that he was actually regarded as a prophet. He was either a soothsayer or some kind of astrologer who predicted future events. That, of course, is complete bunk. Leo never did any such thing. One distinction I think that we as moderns would make that clearly the Byzantines did not is that there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Leo was clearly knowledgeable, and he was clearly a clever person, as seen by his manipulation of the church to get his fourth marriage. However, I don't really see any deep wisdom in Leo. He was learned, but not wise. Only wise in the sense of his own time. His lasting legacy is a little weak for someone with the name The Wise. The Basilica did become the standard law code for the rest of Byzantine history, and it was even revived by the modern state of Greece when it won independence in 1821. However, aside from that, Leo's legacy was a little limited. Sure, he founded the theme of Mesopotamia, but what else did he do that had a long-term lasting impact and was different than something that his father or even Michael III had accomplished? It's hard to think of anything. Leo's fourth marriage divided the church, and it would create a lasting problem for his son and heir, but it did serve to ensure the survival of the Macedonian dynasty, although, of course, many other events over the next few decades would have to occur to allow Constantine to hang on to the throne and pass it on to his own offspring. Militarily, despite having some successes, Leo's reign overall was a disaster. The defeat at the hands of Simeon was by itself enough to offset any of the gains that Leo made in the east. The loss of Sicily was somewhat symbolic, since the Byzantines have been losing ground there for a long time, but still it did show that Leo was not holding his own in that front. When Leo died, despite years of trying to ensure his dynasty's survival, he left his widow and young son in a precarious position. When we look at the life of his brother Alexander, who took over upon Leo's death, we'll see that the survival of Constantine was not a sure thing, and that Leo, as a ruler, left quite a bit to be desired.